Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. I am Rob Farley from the Patterson School of the University of Kentucky, and with me today from Australia is Natalie Sambhi. Natalie, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks, Rob. How are you?
I am fantastic. Could you briefly introduce yourselves to the audience, to Foreign Entanglements?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me, by the way. And yes, I'm coming to you from Canberra. It's still dark outside. We're just coming into dawn.
Mhm.
I'm currently working at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute as an analyst there and also managing editor of our blog, The Strategist, which I
Mhm.
hope you all read. And I'm also vice president of the ACT branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And yeah, that's mostly me.
Right. And we will have your Twitter feed linked from right underneath the page, and so anybody who wants to follow it, which is at Security Scholar, can go ahead and do so. And you've also been in the United States. You were at CNAS for a little bit, and so you're familiar
Yes,
with,
that's right.
yeah, all sorts of U.S. security concerns. So you're actually the second Australian we have had on Foreign Entanglements. The first one was Sam Roggeveen, who we had a couple times from, I forget what his affiliation
The
is.
Lowy Institute.
The Lowy, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So your specialization is in Indonesia, and I suppose we should start off with sort of a little bit of a discussion of sort of, we know where Indonesia is and what Indonesia is, but sort of why is Indonesia sort of growing importance not only to Australia, but regional importance and importance to the United States. What's interesting
Sure.
right now going on with Indonesia and relationships with Indonesia?
Well, there's a lot. First of all, there's a new president. Joko Widodo was elected last year and then came to office in October 2014. And coming from more humble backgrounds, he wasn't an elite. He had a platform of anti-corruption and transparency. We expected somebody that was actually going to be quite good to work with.
Hmm.
In the domestic scene, he's done a lot of really good things. He's cut fuel subsidies, which has freed up revenue for infrastructure, amongst other things. And he's
Hmm.
really got a domestic-focused program where he's focused on making sure there's wealth equality, there is healthcare, there is education. But as an international actor, he's proven to be a little bit trickier to work with,
Hmm.
and that's hard for us because when we see Indonesia, we see the largest country in Southeast Asia, we see
Hmm.
the fourth most populous country in the world, the largest Muslim country in the world,
Hmm.
that has a lot of potential strategically, not only as the de facto leader of ASEAN, but potentially a state which could be more influential in international affairs,
Hmm.
particularly in relations with China, in relations with Japan, relations with the United States. So we're waiting to see where Jokowi's foreign policies unfold, but as we'll get into in a little bit, a bit trickier than we thought.
Hmm. No, it's interesting. Now, so I mean, just yesterday the story emerged that Indonesia had really it said sunk a bunch of a Chinese fishing boat, but in fact it was scuttling a series of different fishing boats that had been acquired over the years. I mean, when you say something like Jakarta has been tricky, so this is tricky from the point of view of sort of Australian foreign policy and also from American foreign policy. Not that those two are the same, but they're linked in some fashion. And so, I mean, do you mean that he's sort of playing a spoiler role in the area, or an unpredictable role, or what does it mean when we say that he's sort of playing a tricky role?
Sure. I think to understand where Jacob is coming from is really
Hmm.
to understand his domestic platform.
Hmm.
So, like I said earlier, he's very much focused on getting Indonesia to realize its potential as what he sees as quite an influential state in the
Hmm.
international system. And so that means making sure infrastructure is up, his people are doing well, that Indonesia's concerns are looked after.
Hmm.
So, when he's dealing with international partners, he's dealing with them from a domestic concern first and foremost. And that's in sorry, it's in stark opposition to the previous president,
Hmm.
who was far more amenable to having good relations with foreign partners.
Hmm.
And so he was a little bit more conciliatory when it came to diplomatic friction,
Hmm.
whereas Jokowi, which is his nickname, is far more hard-nosed about foreign relations. It's Indonesia first, and we'll see how it goes there. And actually, could we talk a little bit about that Chinese boat for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, just to situate the boat burning issue is part of a policy that Jokowi has to crack down on illegal fishing,
Hmm.
which costs the Indonesian economy millions of dollars every year at
Hmm.
least. And so, this is something where Japanese, Thai, Malaysian, and Chinese boats go into Indonesian waters, take fish out of there, obviously bad for local fishermen. So, Jokowi wanted to ramp up this policy of burning foreign vessels as a deterrent, and
Hmm.
he called it shock therapy. So, as you can imagine, for foreign partners, it's not exactly a fluffy and feel-good
No,
policy.
so just to clarify, the crews have been arrested, removed, everything else. The boats are being scuttled far, much
Yes.
much later. And so the crews are repatriated have been
Yes.
repatriated quite some time ago. Then I would expect in this case.
Yeah, they're not on the boat.
Right,
They've
right.
been repatriated and
Well, because
prosecuted
this
in some
boat, I mean, this
instances.
boat, the Chinese boat in particular, was acquired in 2009. I seem to have recalled.
Yeah.
So it's been a
Look,
long time.
that's actually what I was going to say. I mean, people
Hmm.
have said, look, oh, Indonesia has burnt boats from Vietnam, from Thailand,
Hmm.
from the Philippines and Malaysia. So it's prepared to upset its closest partners in ASEAN. It's
Hmm.
prepared to do that. Now, there was some hesitation about whether or not it would do it with China.
Hmm.
People thought, well, look, it's gonna wait a little bit. Obviously, China might have a little bit more leverage on the country. This burning of the boat, on the one hand, shows that Indonesia is prepared to enforce that policy
Hmm.
regardless of the size of its partner. But on the other hand, like you pointed out, the boat was acquired in 2009. So maybe it was low-hanging fruit. There were other boats that were acquired in December, the 22 fishing boats and other larger
Hmm.
trawlers that have been, according to some reports, allowed by the Navy to operate illegally.
Hmm.
So the questions remain about actually the more difficult elements of that policy. Either is Indonesia actually going to go against the harder targets,
Hmm.
or is it just going to burn the softer targets in the older fishing boats that it acquired? So we'll wait to see whether or not Indonesia is going to go hard against China.
Right. So, in terms of thinking about how this foreign policy is very domestically focused, is this playing well? I mean, I understand he's had some approval rating issues already, but is the foreign policy angle at least playing well with the Indonesian public, or at least segments of the Indonesian public? Are people sort of approving of the tack that he has taken with respect to Indonesia's foreign affairs?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Particularly with the boat burning, people were cheering
Hmm.
when the boat burnings were occurring. And yesterday it was held on National Awakening Day. So there's a coincidence there of seeing what an assertion of Indonesian power on the same day as a national celebration.
Hmm.
So that's not by accident. Um, and as we'll talk about in a second, with regards to Jokowi's policy on Australia,
Hmm.
by not being as soft on Australia as his previous as the previous president Yudhoyono,
Hmm.
he's had a lot of support for the way in which he's handled the bilateral relationship. I mean, for better, for worse, for us,
Hmm.
he's getting support for that in Indonesia.
Right. Very briefly, I know we're going to talk about ISIS a little bit later,
Mhm.
but has sort of, as the leader of the world's largest Muslim country, has he taken any efforts to sort of establish himself as a sort of a leader within the world Muslim community, or does that remain something that's still separate from sort of Indonesian national aspiration? And so he's sort of firmly committed on the Indonesian nationalist side, or has he made any movement in this regard?
There's been a little bit of movement. Like I said, his predecessor was far more internationally oriented. So
Hmm.
Yudhoyono was far more focused on becoming a member of OIC and showing
Hmm.
Muslim solidarity as part of a pillar of their foreign policy. Jokowi hasn't shown as much. However, he has, as is the case with other previous presidents, shown support for Palestine.
Hmm.
So there are a few Muslim issues there on his foreign policy radar,
Hmm.
but nothing developed as much as Yudhoyono yet.
Right. So let's talk about sort of what is obviously of most concern to you, which is Indonesia Australia foreign relations, which I know have been have gone through ups and downs over the decades, right? And Indonesia has occupied obviously a very important space within sort of Australia's foreign policy, not only just imagination, but also Australia's sort of practical foreign policy. So where does the relationship stand now? What is it? How has he affected it? In what direction? And like, what effects have there been on the Australian side as well, right? Because it's obviously not a static relationship on either side. But
Sure.
so what's your go ahead?
No, I was going to say you probably picked the best description that we use all the time in Australia. The relationship with Indonesia has its ups and downs,
Hmm.
and at the moment we're in a little bit of a down.
Hmm.
So, like I said earlier, when Jokowi was coming into power, myself included, I thought there would be an opportunity there to build constructive ties with him. His more nationalistic policies have become a bit of a stickler
Hmm.
because there was one particular policy he pushed hard in the last couple of months, which is the execution of drug traffickers.
Right.
Now, according to Jokowi, there is a so-called drug emergency in Indonesia, where an earlier figure of 50 people dying per day was then recalibrated to about 35 people per day.
Hmm.
So in Jokowi's eyes, he was really pursuing something that was going to be of benefit to Indonesian society.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, as part of that, there have been some Australians who were caught and convicted for drug trafficking in places like Bali,
Hmm.
which is a holiday destination for a lot of Australians.
Hmm.
And those convictions, those executions were moved right at the top of the list.
Hmm.
So part of the problem is these cases in Australia receive proportionally more attention in the media than other stories about Indonesia. So that tends to color the way in which we see Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
And so the story that ran here was, Indonesia to kill our boys,
Mm-hmm.
which is a fair interpretation of some of what goes on, but it probably conflates the more challenging dynamics of the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Indonesia was enforcing a domestic policy. Sorry, cat's just getting busy. And from our perspective, those two particular individuals, Andrew Chan and Muran Sukumaran, were seen as largely reformed. So they'd been in prison for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, Andrew Chan became a pastor and provide pastoral care to a lot of other prisoners. Muran Sukumaran became an accomplished painter and provided a whole number of programs to fellow prisoners, including computer programs and anti-drug campaigns as well. So from Australia's side, it was sort of, well, why is Indonesia going hard against these guys? They've done their time, they've done the crime, they've done the time. From Indonesia's perspective, it was, these are two drug traffickers, why do you care?
Right.
And unfortunately, this particular issue, as is the case always with bilateral relationship, is played out in the media. Our leadership, a couple of our leaders made comments such as, well, we gave Indonesia millions of dollars in aid after the 2004 tsunami. In the context of this particular issue, effectively linking these things, the Indonesian side and understanding historically where Indonesia is coming from, a country that had fought colonial powers, took great offense to that, and understandably so. So as you can see, it was a back and forth. In the months leading up to the executions, there was a delay in the executions. There were things done on the Indonesian side which exacerbated the problem. For instance, when they were transferring the prisoners from one prison to another, there were Sukhoi escorts for the prisoners.
Right.
And there was a great show of military might, which Australia just sort of thought that was Indonesia thumbing their noses to them.
Right.
So, yeah, it was just being amplified as things went by. And getting worse, and each side was playing to a domestic audience. So our side were playing to our domestic audience here. The Indonesia side said this is about sovereignty. This is about, enacting our own laws. The Australian side said this was about mercy. So there was a fundamental conflict there.
So I mean, especially in the case of drug smuggling is just sort of one larger part of a larger. I mean, it's something important on its own, but it's also part of a larger set of concerns about maritime security, right? And so has this really sort of jeopardized, specifically on the drug smuggling aspect, international cooperation between Australia and Indonesia, which I imagine would have to have potentially huge benefits for both countries, and has it also jeopardized sort of broader maritime cooperation between Australia and Indonesia?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, Indonesia for us is an extremely important security partner, and not least for counterterrorism, which we'll talk about as well a bit later, but particularly military cooperation, information sharing, people trafficking, and trafficking of illicit goods as well. Thankfully, this time around, there wasn't a suspension of security ties. So back in 2013 in November, when we got caught, quote unquote, spying on the Indonesian president and his wife and his inner circle, the Indonesian government cut security ties for a while.
Was this part of a broader sort of Snowden fallout, or was this something else?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this was a Snowden fallout. And as a result, all defense cooperation was ceased for a while, and that included defense exercises, defense exchanges, and the like, which had actually quite an impact on relations. They've since grown back to where they were since then, although there are some areas that are still to be reinstated. But this time around, thankfully, no cuts in cooperation. Australia did two things. It took back its ambassador for consultations, which is not the same thing as a full recall, and also we cut ministerial ties for a little bit. But that doesn't mean the actual substantial security relationship was cut, thankfully.
Right. So how much longer is there anticipation now in Australia, or any sort of thinking about sort of how long, first, how much longer is Jokowi's term, right? How long before new elections? And is there in Australia any sort of looking forward to that, or any sort of idea about what succession might look like, in the future, or is there like he's our guy for now, and so we have to manage him for as long as we have him?
Sure, that's a really important point. I should probably rewind to last year's election, where the other opponent that was there was what was at the time seemed far more nationalistic candidate who came from the military. So he represented a harking back to the old school times of Suharto and the dictatorship and and far more challenging times. So, at the time, that was the contrast. Indonesia at the moment has elected, Jokowi. He's our guy for the next, he's got a 5-year term. If he plays well domestically, that could be extended to a second term, so that we could effectively be looking at a 10-year time frame with Jokowi. But I think as time goes by, not only for Australia, but for the United States and other countries, really understanding what Jokowi wants. Where are you going to build good partnerships with Jokowi with regards to infrastructure and investment, particularly maritime security, which is a key concern of his? That could actually be a far more constructive way of dealing with Indonesia.
Right, and I mean, I think as you've suggested, right, I mean, and the nationalist turn is not necessarily negative, perhaps maybe more problematic for Australia than for the United States. From the U.S. perspective, the nationalist turn is not necessarily a negative one if the nationalist attitudes sort of play out in an anti-China way, or in any sort of way that sort of leads Indonesia to be a more assertive actor in the South China Sea. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, look, I probably should highlight that a strong Indonesia, a strong, stable, democratic Indonesia is certainly in Australia's interests, and especially in the United States as well. And if that means Jokowi securing economic growth, making sure infrastructure is consolidated, ports, railroads, roads, and wealth is equally distributed such that that doesn't become a factor that could potentially lead to instability, then those are all good things. It's a question of how strong beyond that, which is something that us strategic thinkers are thinking about.
Right. So let's then shift a little bit to sort of what we previewed before, which is the role that both Australia and Indonesia have to play in the rebalance, right? Or I guess we're calling it the rebalance now instead of the pivot. I always like the pivot. I like the pivot because I liked saying Pacific pivot, because Pacific pivot makes it sound so not military, even though it's still, obviously quite military. But what is your sort of view of how Indonesia is going to try to sort out its role in this future of what is, I guess broadly being defined as a redistribution of diplomatic and military effort by the United States towards East Asia from Europe and the Middle East? Sort of where does Indonesia carve out its place in this emerging future?
Sure. I mean, just as a quick backgrounder, there was a little bit of resistance to the idea of the rebalance when it was announced in 2011. Yudhoyono was all for it, and he said this is a good thing and that we could make use of the Marines located in Darwin for trilateral or even multilateral cooperation. So that's a good thing. Since then, Jokowi has made some statements saying that there probably shouldn't be any preponderant power in this particular area, and he's not a fan of there being unnecessary tensions. So we will see where this will lead. My concern, Jokowi being domestically focused, he may not be so engaged in wanting to build military ties, although he is keen to push forward Indonesia's minimum essential force project, which is its force modernization. So looking at that kind of potential
minimum essential force. Why is it? What does that mean exactly? Minimum essential force project.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Indonesia's military capability has grown in spurts. During the Suharto years, acquisition was done, how do I put this, on a far more nepotistic basis rather than a needs basis. And under the previous president, Yudhoyono, he wanted to rebuild the military force based on need. So he wanted to build the minimum force required to protect the Indonesian archipelago, and that meant building up the Navy and Air Force, because traditionally Indonesia's army has been very strong. Which doesn't make sense for an archipelago in a way, but it made sense when the army was used for internal security.
Right.
And now that the army, for the most part, which is an interesting point, for the most part has gotten out of internal security issues, the Navy and Air Force, must be built up again. And so now that it's looking to build up partners in the United States or Russia or China or Japan for military parts, it is looking to fill those gaps. So that's minimum essential force. And that means doing things like making sure its submarine fleet, it has fighters, it has cruisers and so forth.
So you mentioned the Sukhois earlier. When did the Sukhois, and sort of who are the major procurement partners that Indonesia has worked with? And I know that Jokowi has also, done some work in terms of domestic defense industry, or sort of, at least sort of, there's been talk of sort of building up Indonesia's domestic defense industries. But who are its major acquisition partners? Who have been its acquisition partners over the past decade or so?
Sure. I mean, for a country like Australia, easy answer is the United States. For a country
Mm-hmm.
like Indonesia, that's been a little bit more non-aligned and burnt by things like arms embargoes with the United States,
Mm-hmm.
the answer really is anyone and everyone. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
but predominantly Russia and the United States. So it has
Mm-hmm.
mixed fleets, for instance. Um, and I think also from other countries within the region, it was looking to develop another fighter with South Korea, for instance. It's
Mm-hmm.
also looking at acquiring, it has C-130s,
Mm-hmm.
used C-130s from Australia, so there's military equipment transfer by third parties as well, but it runs a bit of a composite force. Like you said, it has a defense industry as well, a domestic defense industry that it's trying to prop up,
Mm-hmm.
and that provides things like small arms and ammunition, and as well as armored personnel carriers.
Mm-hmm. So, how has ASEAN used its leadership, or how has Indonesia used its leadership role in ASEAN as a way of sort of, um, uh, I don't know if it's sort of trying to prevent regional hegemony or the emergence of a regional hegemony or whatever else. I mean, how is it? How does it treat ASEAN? How does it think of ASEAN as a tool for sort of the furtherance of Indonesian ends?
That's really interesting. So the previous president saw ASEAN as extremely important, and so did
Mm-hmm.
his foreign minister, Marty Natalegawa. So they used ASEAN as a forum to propose new ideas, like treaties, for instance, that would bind Asia Pacific countries into
Mm-hmm.
acting, with in accordance with certain norms and ideas of amity and cooperation. But those things didn't really take off. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
ASEAN is still an extremely important part of an Indonesian foreign policy, and it's a place where it has a lot of clout,
Mm-hmm.
but only if it uses it correctly. And at the moment, a lot of the advisors of the president have said, look, ASEAN has always been the cornerstone of Indonesian foreign policy, but now it is a cornerstone. So
Mm-hmm.
it'll be interesting to see to what extent Indonesia pours time and resources into ASEAN. The Secretariat is in Jakarta and is actually quite under-resourced compared to what it's been asked to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I think ASEAN actually has a lot of potential, actually, and should band together, given all the strategic challenges that are going on in the South China Sea, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I mean, there are still some states playing spoiler roles, like Cambodia playing spoiler roles in ASEAN that sort of prevent long-term action, I guess, or concerted action. Um, so let's talk a little bit about. I know that I mean, obviously, there have been some high profile in the past. There have been some high profile, and I think these two issues are going to be related, right? Sort of the ISIS question with the migrant question eventually too, but. There have been high-profile terrorist attacks in Indonesia over the years. Um, what is sort of the Indonesian reaction to the rise of ISIS? How has it treated the developments in Syria and Iraq? How have these characterized? And it's obviously distant from some of Indonesia's core foreign policy concerns, but there are obviously also, I would expect, there would be some concern about this extremely popular group emerging, or not extremely popular, this viral group emerging in a part of the world that's also quite Islamic.
Sure. I think there are a couple of parts to that. First is the
Mm-hmm.
attraction of ISIS in Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some reports that say that ISIS has a great appeal, this whole idea of a foreign jihad. It has asked local jihadists in Indonesia to drop their local jihad against the police and the state and
Mm-hmm.
to come over to Syria and to fight on behalf of other Muslims. So there have been, rough figures, anywhere between 50 and 150 Indonesians have gone over to fight
Mm-hmm.
in Syria, and many of them have been killed.
I mean, that's not a huge number given sort of the number
No.
of French and British and Europeans who have gone over. So, I mean, especially from the world's largest Islamic state, that's not an impressive number, or that is an impressive number, depending on your perspective. So.
Sure. I mean, there are a couple of things that I think first is a question of resources.
Mm-hmm.
So, unlike, in other countries, the ease of travel is a different factor here,
Mm-hmm.
and some Indonesians have difficulty making sure they can get overseas to
Mm-hmm.
Turkey and whatnot. They've also been intercepted on the way there. So there have been groups of people, families who have been trying to go through Malaysia and whatnot, were stopped at the airport, which I think is testament to at least some of the counterterrorism
Mm-hmm.
capability that Southeast Asia has developed after 9/11 and after the Bali bombings, particularly Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
The Indonesian counterterrorism forces have done a lot of work. They have a very different approach to counterterrorism as Australia does,
Mm-hmm.
but they are effective in what they are
How
trying to
so? What's
do.
the different approach from Australia, or how would you characterize the differences?
They have a far more kinetic approach
Mm-hmm.
that is involved. They have far more I had their main counterterrorism force, Detachment 88 or Densus 88, as they're known, which is trained by Americans and Australians, are probably bordering on a paramilitary force. So a lot of their operations actually involve shootouts in which a lot of the suspects end up getting killed. And so there is more of a culture of these are bad guys and we're going to kill them, as opposed to let's surveil and see. It's just a very different approach there.
Have any of the concerns about sort of foreign jihadist terrorism mapped onto existing ethnic or geographic divisions in Indonesia, right? I mean, are there places where sort of this has the potential to become concentrated and virulent because it becomes part of an existing, archipelagic dispute, right? Some sort of long-term conflict.
I think it's important to note that there are still terrorist networks in Indonesia, and they are going to be the source of people who will be sympathetic to ISIS. And so there are still groups operating like Jemaah Islamiyah, the Mujahideen of Eastern Indonesia. And they, for instance, like MIT, they're located in parts of the archipelago Poso, which are away from the capital, where they effectively have a small pocket of control. And at the moment, their leadership has had limited success in linking up with ISIS. But I've read a report recently that said once that particular leader goes, that vacuum could be filled by a more experienced jihadist who comes back from Syria. And once that happens, tapping into that established network with family ties and ties with schools and whatnot, that could be far more of a concern to Indonesia than at present.
Are there concerns about transnational connections within Southeast Asia, so sort of with rebels in the south of Thailand or Islamic rebels in the Philippines and so forth? Is there any sort of networking along that scale not related to ISIS, or is there concern about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the past, Indonesian jihadists have either sought refuge in Malaysia or had linkages with some of the groups in southern Philippines as well. So that potential certainly exists, but it's unclear at the moment.
Right. So how about we tack over to the migration issue, which is not just a Southeast Asian concern, right? I mean, migrant issues are now, have largely because of what's happening in the Mediterranean, not what's happening in Southeast Asia, have sort of become a core world issue, right? And part of this is sort of the emerging, with still the fallout from Libya and Eritrea and so forth. But what's the state of sort of concern about migrant issues in Southeast Asia at the moment, and especially between Indonesia and Australia?
Well, it's certainly landed on their desks with all the urgency in the world at the moment. I think some of the operations in Thailand that have cracked down against people smugglers have inadvertently led to this wave of I would prefer to call them asylum seekers, by the way. Migrants sort of suggest that there's a lot of choice there, but I think for some of these communities leaving these areas, there isn't much choice. And in Australia, we also have a so-called migrant issue. We call them asylum seekers. And from us, I guess from our perspective, it is a diabolical problem. And I can see from Indonesia's perspective a similar themes, similar threads, and it really is an issue that needs to be solved, but with no easy answer. I think some of the solution has been a distribution of resources among Southeast Asia. Indonesia has said that it'll keep as many as it can for a year, and then after that they need to be relocated. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that A, they can't necessarily absorb all of those migrants, but B, that's not necessarily the case that they're wanted, which is a problem. And I think there are similar themes with that in Australia as well. But there are humanitarian obligations, obviously, but, like as in Australia, domestic politics comes first, and our previous government was elected on a platform of stopping the boats. It's a very blunt policy statement. I would venture to guess that Indonesia's domestic imperatives may drive it to act in a similar way.
It's interesting. It's not as if we haven't had migrant issues in the past around the world, right? But the migrant issues we are having today seem sort of to rise to I'm spitballing a little bit here, but it goes with some thinking I've also been doing, right? Sort of this concern about the long-term viability of sort of the nation-state model, right? And as nation states deteriorate or weaken, especially in places that sort of export migrants, the ability of the nation states that import migrants to sort of manage these flows and manage in whatever way they choose to manage seems to really be be being tapped, right? Even in sort of very advanced, wealthy industrial democracies like Europe, Southern Europe, and in Australia, but also in a place like Indonesia, where there's not necessarily sort of this wealthy infrastructure that could be supportive of these migrant flows in the first place. Right? I mean, it seems a devilishly, as you suggest, a devilishly difficult problem from both sort of practical and moral and theoretical standpoints. Right? And I mean, what steps to take to manage this really seems striking.
I mean, it's an issue that's polarized Australian society. So part of our solution has been offshore processing. So we, together with some Pacific states and some territories that we have off Australia and Christmas Island, whatnot, Nauru, which is a Pacific state, we have put processing centers there, and we have put migrants or asylum seekers in detention centers, which, as you can imagine, has a range of psychological and physical effects on them. But there is just simply no domestic appetite here to allow them to be here. No overwhelming anyway. Of course, there are groups in Australia that are sympathetic to their cause and who are calling the government to be far more, humane in their approach. But this is the ultimate problem. And Australia has the luxury of being an island nation. We have a strong navy, so we can intercept these kinds of these vessels. But, that also takes its toll on our Navy, having to witness people in dire humanitarian conditions. Right. So there's really no good way of going about it.
Right. Well, I mean, to wrap up, and this has been a fantastic conversation, but so what do you think are the top 2 or 3 big issues we're going to see in the next 5 years with respect to U.S., Australian, and Indonesian relations? Like, what's going to be really important? I'm interested in the defense acquisition side, but other people have different. I'm interested in Australian submarines and sort of what's going to turn out there. But that's just my concern. But probably nobody else shares it except Australians and Japanese. But anyway. So what do you think are sort of the big 2 or 3 things we're going to have to really think about and look at over the next 5 years with respect to relations between the 3 countries?
Oh, South China Sea has got to be up there. It's got to be up there. And so, I mean, even though you mentioned the 3 countries, the big panda in the room is obviously China. What are China's intentions? How are we going to manage our economic relationships with some of the provocations that have been occurring in the security space? I think is a question for all 3 countries, to be honest, because as Indonesia seeks Chinese investment, it too will have to reconcile what it's going to be doing about the balance between security and economics. Between Australia and the United States, I think a relationship. I think a lot of Americans take it as a given statement. This is my judgment from sitting on forums and discussing security, is that Australia is always going to be in the American camp. I think that's likely to be the case, but I think there is an underestimation of being in this region, what it is like to be situated far more proximate to a changing strategic landscape. With a potentially very strong partner in China, a strong figure in the region, causing these kinds of effects and potential strategic competition between China and Japan. I mean, these sorts of dynamics are far closer to home for us, and I'm not sure whether our American partners actually, some of them appreciate that. Right. So actually, that we'll see where the ANZUS relationship transforms, but certainly between Australia and Indonesia. It's a wait and see with President Jokowi. I hope there'll be a far more constructive relationship, but I anticipate there'll be a few more of these diplomatic fallouts. But for now, at least, we've seen a taste of what it might be like, and hopefully, as time goes by, we're less prepared to put domestic concerns above the bilateral relationship, because it truly is an important relationship for us.
All right. Well, thank you so much for getting up so early in the morning to speak with me. I'm in a pleasant afternoon. You're very much in the early morning in Australia. So, thank you, and we would love to have you again at some point.
No worries, Robert. It was heaps of fun. Thank you very much.
All right.